Are we good to go? My, oh, it's too dark. Sorry, guys. How's that? The best part are the flower pictures. So at least the people zooming can see. So are we on? Okay. All right, hi, everybody. I know we're in the middle of midterms and things are crazy, so I'm happy you're here. Because of our technical trouble, we are gonna put off doing our talk on diseases and pests, and instead we're gonna talk about flowers, which this week has been a great week for flowers. So we're just gonna roll into this. So what I want you to take away from this talk is that bloom times really vary with rain, with temperature. I've charted a lot of common honey plants over the years, and you can see a bloom time variation between 3 and 4 weeks for plants. So when you're looking at your bees, you need to be conscious of what's blooming and what the weather's like and what's going on at that level. And to be aware of kind of the seasonal dearths that we have and how we're going to monitor our bees to make sure they don't starve during those dearths. So we're going to jump into this talk, and this of course is a poppy. I'm going to talk a lot about plants and try not to get too carried away, but all of these are plants that honeybees utilize. Some of them are native, some of them are non-natives. A lot of them are planted in areas. Even if you don't have them in your yard, you might have them in your neighborhood. So I usually note on the plant, on the image of the plant, whether it's a native or a non-native, or whether it's an invasive species. So not all the plants I'm showing you are plants I recommend you plant. So we start with the poppy. And now it doesn't want to. Sorry, it doesn't want to advance. We'll just do it this way. Okay, so camellias, which are blooming right now, they're kind of crossover between 1 year and the next year. If you think about the season starting kind of in January, we have some camellias that are blooming in November, December, and some that bloom January, February, even into March. And then the Prunus family, we're going to talk about a little more. This is just an introduction. Heading into spring, more Prunus, Veronica, quince. These are just some images. So we need to talk about the relationship between honeybees and plants. And so the critical thing for plants is they want to be cross-pollinated. And cross-pollination leads to greater variety in plants. You get more sports, you get more diversity, you get a quicker change in a plant, which makes the plant more adaptable and more able to adapt to a specific climate, to climate change. So cross-pollination is a great thing for plants. To encourage pollinators, they have pollen, which is a high protein source, and nectar, which of course is the sugar source for bees. We've kind of talked about what bees do when they're foraging. So now we're going to kind of change our perspective, and instead of looking at it from a bee's perspective for a minute, we're going to look at it from a plant perspective. Let's see if this is going to work. Oh, there we go. Is that that's not going to show up for them. It's just going to show up for you guys. So if you look at the bee on the right screen, that's a bee with red maple pollen on it. And you can see the corbiculi, or the pollen pack on the back leg of the bee, is completely full of pollen. And also the hairs on the bee have pollen attached to them. The bee on the left is actually a bumblebee, and it's on an asparagus plant. And look at the different texture and color of the pollen on the bumblebee. So angiosperms are the types of plants that require cross-pollination. Gymnosperms are the earlier plants like ferns and palms, and they're self-pollinating, so they don't have this system. And what you can see here in this lily is you see that the pollen is way up away from where the ovule of the plant is. So this kind of prevents self-pollination. So the bees collect that pollen, but then when they climb down in to get the nectar of the next lily, then they deposit the pollen in the other plant. So that's one of the ways that a plant will work to create to get the pollen to travel and also to get this cross-pollination. Okay, so when you're thinking about all of this, when you're thinking about, okay, the bees need the flowers, where are the flowers, when are they blooming, how do I get the maximum out of where I have my bees? Well, a lot of people are going to put their bees in their backyard and they're going to be limited by what's around them. But if you have the opportunity, you have friends with farms, your pollinating service for somebody, you can really site your hive in different places. And the things you want to look for in the Piedmont of North Carolina is you want to look for lots of tulip poplar trees. And we're going to look at some tulip poplars later, but that is your main honey crop. So that's the main tree that you need to be able to recognize. So you want lots of tulip poplars. You want a variety of habitat. So it'd be nice if you had like a swampy area near your hives. And we're talking like a 1 mile radius from the hives, which is a huge amount of area. So you want forest, you want fields, you want roadside ditches, you want formal gardens, if that's a possibility. You want people farming a variety of crops. All of those things are going to increase the potential nectar that is available for your bees. And you want lots and lots of weeds. And this is the only time you want lots and lots of weeds, but it will change your perspective about what a weed is and how your relationship with weeds is. Okay, so we're looking at bees right now. What they're trying to do is they're trying to build up for the spring. So right now, this is a picture of where I used to have my hives. It's got red dead nettles in it. This is what it looks like at my house right now, right? The trees are bare, the red dead nettles are going to town, and I want those bees out there foraging, building up their population so that I have a really good population when the tulip poplar comes. And then I also, in the late fall, late summer, early fall, I want there to be a lot of nectar because that's when the bees are feeding the young bees that are going to go through the winter. So both times of year are kind of critical. And we're going to keep talking about these times of dearth and times of critical feeding. Obviously, the bees need food year round. They're good about storing food, but there are critical moments. So this is one, late winter, early spring, and then late summer, early fall. All right, so we're gonna seasonally talk about what's blooming. I'm gonna kind of move quickly through this. If you guys have questions, send them in and we'll stop and I'll answer them, or you guys in the room, just let me know, because I can talk more about any individual plant at probably too great a length. As Crystal says, I can definitely talk too much about a plant. So this is Mahonia or Oregon grape. So this is not native to the Piedmont. It is native to the continental United States. It's a wonderful plant in a lot of cultivation. You see it around buildings. We use it on campus a lot. This particular image is the old standard, which is very thorny. There's a lot of cultivars out there now that have really soft leaves. What's amazing is this plant is blooming in like December and January. So they've mostly stopped on campus. I think I haven't seen them blooming in the last week or two. But when they bloom, they're an amazing source for honeybees. And then they get great berries on them, which is a great source for birds. This is honeysuckle, but this is the bush honeysuckle. It's exotic, but it's an old standard planting at like farmhouses. So it's been in this part of the United States for a fairly long time. It's a bush honeysuckle, not a vine honeysuckle. And the honeysuckle that we're mostly familiar with is the Japanese honeysuckle, which is very invasive and also is too narrow for the bees to access the nectar. So get rid of your Japanese honeysuckle, but if you have bush honeysuckle near you, it's a great plant. You can see lots and lots of pollen, lots of nectar, a great scent. They're blooming right now on campus. Just saw someone cut one to the ground for some obscure reason while it was in full bloom, but wonderful plant. This is Chimonanthus. There's one of these, a fairly large one in the Arboretum. It's kind of an unusual plant. It's an exotic, but it's very beautiful, has a lovely scent, and the honeybees love it. So if you're looking for something kind of striking and you're not planting just natives, it's a wonderful plant. All right, and here's our standby, red maple. Red maple's kind of the first big honey plant of the season. So right now, the red maple at my house is going to seed. It definitely looks red from down below, but the blooms have already shifted to seed. Red maples are great trees. They're getting kind of a bad reputation because they don't do well as street side plantings. They need coolness around their roots because they're susceptible to a specific pathogen that's when they're in like a heat island, it does better and then the tree suffers. So they're fine to keep planting them in regular landscapes, but they were at one time really popular as like planted on devil strips in roads or planted in parking lots. And we're seeing the ones that are planted in those conditions dying now. So right now, landscapers are kind of like, oh, I'm not going to plant red maples. People should keep planting red maples just in places where there's plenty of soil around them and they're not surrounded by concrete. So flowering quince, this is an old standby also. Great plant. Mine is just starting to bloom right now. Honeybees love it. It also produces quince, which is kind of a fruit, kind of a bitter fruit, but people make quince jelly. Anything else with quince? I know they make a jelly. I think you have to add sugar to quince. Maybe you can make a pie or something similar, but excellent honey plant. This is winter aconite, and this is my stand-in for all kind of winter bulbs. So I've seen bees on daffodils and narcissus and lots of other different winter flowering bulbs, which obviously the daffodils are going to town right now and the bees will be on that. But this plant, aconite, it's very low growing with this wonderful green little pocket that the flowers sit in. And the bees will choose this over many other things blooming at the same time. Like if you're in a garden and this is blooming and say Daphne's blooming and trying to think what else would be blooming right at this time and other daffodils and things, this is the plant the bees are going to be on, which means it's a really good nectar source. So I'm going to talk a little bit about elms, but this also includes oaks and other hardwood trees. You don't think about them blooming, but they have blooms. So you're seeing the blossom on an elm tree, which as a flower is not all that exciting, but for a honeybee, this is a really good source. So what we see is the red maple comes first, and then like the sugar maples and the silver maples, the other varieties will start blooming afterwards. The elms and the oaks will bloom after that. And they're not huge on nectar, but they are really good pollen. And since this is a time when the queen is really starting to lay, pollen is very critical. and Lenten roses hellebores, which of course are not native, but are also not very invasive. They'll spread, but only in a kind of a limited way. So we call these Lenten roses because they bloom around Lent, but there's also other varieties. There's a stinking hellebore, which is really beautiful with green flowers. There's a Christmas rose, which is a hellebore that blooms just before Christmas. And then there's lots of cultivated forms of hellebores. So an excellent plant, very deer proof. So this is a great plant if you've got a shady area under a tree where nothing else wants to grow. You've got a place where the deer graze. You can add a couple hellebore and they'll begin to fill in until they get to the point where they've, just amassed themselves in that bare space. And honeybees absolutely love them. And I know earlier on we talked a little bit about the appendages of honeybees, the fact that their aureola have both little claws and little suction pads. And you can see the way this bee is hanging underneath this flower. She's having to grip, right? With those little claws to hang on. So that's like an amazing thing. So watching bees collect pollen is a pretty fascinating activity. And photographing bees collecting pollen is a great hobby, although it might make you just slightly crazy. All right, so that's kind of it. So in the winter time, which we're right at this moment, leaving these winter plants, many of them are still blooming, but we're starting to move into the spring plants. So it's a time to really be aware of the weather and really be aware of the stores that your bees have. Because right now, you could have 3 rainy days in a row and you could have a hive starve. Because they're starting to bring things in. We're having nice warm days, but then you get a cold spell and they're trapped in the hive and they're starting to build up their population. And they're probably low on the stores that they put in the fall. And so this is that moment where you just need to be really conscious of how much food your bees have. And so we're going to roll into spring. And obviously in the springtime, there's a million things that bloom and we can't talk about all of them. So I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights of spring. And if there's a plant that you have a question about, just interrupt me and I'll tell you if I know about its relationship to honeybees. So this is just a list of spring weeds. What we're seeing on the right is henbit, which is a kind of lamium. And we're going to talk more about lamiums. There are lots of weeds this time of year. And this is a great time if you have a lawn to really increase your bees' food source by not putting down pre-emergence, by allowing the weeds to grow up in your lawn, and by holding off on mowing. So if you wait just a little later to start your spring mowing cycle, these weeds will have a chance to come up and bloom and spread. And this is just out in my yard, and you can see it's very beautiful, but it definitely doesn't look like a well-manicured lawn. And this is another of the lamiums, which is a great family that honeybees love. It's in the mint family. So if you looked at it, it would have a square stem. And this is the red dead nettle. So from a distance right now, if you go past a unmanicured lawn or a field, you can sometimes see kind of a carpet of red. And that's the leaves on the tops of the red dead nettle. Beautiful plant, excellent to include in your pollinator lawn. Mustards, of course, anything in the brassica family, which includes like kale, cabbage, broccoli. All of the brassicas are great for honeybees. This is just a wild mustard that grows along the roadside. I assume that it's a weed seed that we brought with us from Europe, but excellent plant for honeybees. definitely could be left in the landscape. Not going to cause you very much trouble. And also left in your gardens. If you're done harvesting for the year and you can let those plants bolt and go to seed. My grandfather, who was a beekeeper, his greens patch that he had was mostly mustard greens, and he would just let it, he'd harvest through the winter, he'd let it bolt when it warmed up, he'd let it reseed, and he never had to replant those plants. They would just come back every year. So it was great. It was great for his bees and great for his eating. Okay, so Prunus, we saw a picture of a Prunus earlier. It was a Prunus mume, which is one of the first in this family to bloom. Obviously, this family includes almonds, apricots, cherries, plums. They're all Prunus. Bees love all of them. Pears are in a different family, and the composition of the nectar in pears is not great for honeybees. Honeybees will pollinate a pear tree, but if they have a choice between a cherry and a pear, they're always going to go to the cherry first. So if you're growing pears and you're having trouble with fruiting, you may want to increase the number of pollinators you have around so that they do get pollinated. So excellent addition if you need to add a small tree to your landscape, or if you're planning a landscape for somebody, any one of the Prunuses is a good choice. They're pretty. In North Carolina and the Piedmont, they very rarely get diseases compared to other fruiting trees. So pears have some problems, and apple trees have a lot of problems. So if you're looking for something that fruits and that you're not going to have to treat with any kind of pesticide to keep it healthy, cherries and plums are definitely the way to go. Apricots don't, they do okay here, but I don't think we usually get edible apricots here. I mean, I've seen apricot trees drop apricots, but I don't think they're very good varieties. And almonds, I've never seen I've seen almond trees here bloom and be beautiful, but I've never seen them produce almonds. Okay, so the Malus family is the family that apples are in. Most of our American apples are a cross between European apples and our native crab apples. So crab apples are a great old native tree. They tend to sucker a lot, but you know, they seem to be invincible, and they're beautiful, and bees and butterflies and all sorts of pollinators love them. Birds love them because they get so many insects on them, and also because they get crab apples on them. So they're just an incredible host tree. If you put one in a landscape, you're going to increase the diversity in your yard immensely with one tree. So I can't praise them enough. Redbuds, we're seeing the redbuds just starting to bud out on campus. You see the little bit of the purple tips in places. Obviously, redbuds are native. They grow wild along our edges of our woods, but there's lots of cultivated redbuds around. So there's lots that you can choose from if you're looking for a small ornamental tree. And this is a favorite of honeybees. Great nectar source. So excellent tree to add, excellent tree to be aware of. If you're looking around, like where you're potentially setting a hive, just kind of becoming aware of how many redbuds are around where you are. Okay, so we're going to talk for just a minute about clovers. This is a crimson clover on the screen. This is my favorite clover. We also have trifoliate or white clover, which is a low growing clover that grows in the lawn. I definitely have that, and I've planted it into my lawn. I think any grass seed mix should include clover, especially not high sun summer grasses, but winter grasses, cool season grasses like fescues benefit immensely from having white clover or trifolium clover added to them. But crimson clover is a perfect cover crop. So if you're turning your garden under for the winter or parts of it under for the winter, September is a great time to plant crimson clover, and then it'll start blooming mid to late March. It's a wonderful source for honeybees, and it's also a nitrogen fixer. So when you turn it into your soil, it's going to improve your soil quality. So, and unlike vetch, which is also a great honey plant, it's more controllable in your garden setting. All right, any questions about clover? Okay, so clover honey, we talk about clover honey all the time. Out west, they have sweet clover, which is in a different family of clovers. It's like a tall plant that comes up kind of waist high and is pretty leggy with white or yellow flowers. You can plant it here. It doesn't do great, but in the West, it's one of the main honey crops. So when you go to like the grocery store to buy honey, 90% of the time you're getting clover honey. Has kind of an after bite on the tongue. So next class, I will definitely bring in some honey. So we can sample some different varieties of honey and see how the taste of honey really varies from the flower that it's made from. All right, hollies. UNC is pretty famous for our hollies. The person that followed Coker as kind of the director of plantings on campus was a holly fanatic. And so we have tons of hollies. This is a Chinese holly, which is what most of us are familiar with. They're pretty large. They've got very waxy leaves that tend to have thorns on them. And we have them all over campus. But we also have small Japanese hollies. We have American holly. There's one just outside of this building in the gallery garden. It's just beautiful. We have some gallberry and some of the hollies that grow closer to the coast. And this is an amazing plant for honeybees. It's an immense producer of flowers. So you can see this on this photo, and it has berries still on it that the birds haven't collected. And then it's got hundreds of tiny flowers just on that one branch. This holly tree is probably 15 feet tall and 10 feet across. So you can kind of multiply that out and think about how much blooms are on it. So I'm not a huge fan of Chinese hollies, but I am a fan of hollies in general and using them in the landscape. And obviously there are wild hollies in our woods. And if you're planting natives, you have a lot of choices in hollies you can go with. So we're kind of rolling through the season. So we've gotten past the point we're at, and we're moving a little later into the spring. And everything in the rubus family, blackberries and raspberries start to bloom. This is a huge source for honeybees, especially if you live in a rural setting. Your ditches are probably full of blackberries. You may have planted raspberries in your garden, but these plants are very prolific. Obviously, they're, a little painful, and maybe you think they're a little messy looking and that you ought to clean them up. But what I say is, if you have a setting where it's not necessary for someone to traverse that space, and you leave your wild blackberries, you're providing great forage for your honeybees, and you're also providing a lot of fruit for native wildlife. So it's a great plant. And you can, if you're gardening, you can get a thornless blackberry. I don't think the flavor is as good as a wild blackberry, but you certainly can avoid the thorns if you want to. All right, persimmon, we never see the flowers of a persimmon. They're very, very tiny, but this is a wonderful native tree. They're a little spready, And they're a little spready in part because so much wildlife eats persimmon and carries the seeds off. So I have both Asian persimmons in my yard and native persimmons in my yard. Honeybees love the flowers. My dogs and the possums and the raccoons and an assortment of wildlife love the fruit. So great, great tree, great addition, and a great native plant. So we get into the spring honey flow, and you can see in this image where we pulled a bunch of supers off of some hives and we're getting ready to harvest the honey. I think this is actually maybe post-harvest and we're letting the bees clean it out because there's an awful lot of bees. So blueberries are a great crop in terms of honey. They make an amazing honey. Honeybees are super necessary for pollination of blueberry plants. So lots of people who have little small organic blueberry farms are looking for beekeepers. And you may get them to pay you, and that would be great. But if they don't pay you, you're still going to benefit from the fact that the blueberries are producing really good nectar and creating like this excitement in the hive. Like when there's a good honey flow, the bees really ramp up for that good honey flow. And the blueberries tend to bloom just before the tulip poplars. So if you have your bees very excited about being on blueberries, and then the tulip poplars come in behind that, you're going to increase your yield of tulip poplar honey. So the other thing to note that's of interest here is that if you see this bee, the opening of the flower is really too small for the bee to get in there, right? She's trying to do it, but she can't. But she has an advantage, which is that these blueberries have already been worked over by bumblebees. And so what bumblebees do is they've got much chewier mouth parts, right? They mostly nest solitary in the ground, so they're chewers. So what the bumblebees do is they chew little circular holes in the base of the flower, and that allows them to access the pollen and the nectar. So can everybody see that? The little elliptical holes towards the tops of the flowers? Can you make that out? This isn't going to help the people there, but let's see if I can show you with the. It's still not going to. All right, well, it's not going to work. So that's a great thing. Bumblebees individually, one bumblebee against one honeybee, the bumblebee's a better pollinator. But you don't have that many bumblebees and you have 50,000 honeybees. So a hive of honeybees are going to outcompete a colony of bumblebees. But they work together and it's to everyone it's advantage. All right, tulip poplars. So here's a tulip poplar flower from above. You usually don't see them from here because they're mostly in the tops of the trees. Tulip poplar trees can be 40 to 60 feet tall. If you have one, you tend to have at least 20 because they tend to seed in around themselves. They're fairly fast growing trees. We would almost call them weed trees. And each blossom can have up to 2 tablespoons of nectar in it. So if you walk under a tulip poplar tree after a windy day and you look at the ground under the tree, you'll probably see some blossoms that have blown off, but you'll also see that the ground is shiny. And that's because there's so much nectar in the tops of the trees that it can get knocked out and fall to the ground and create this like sticky layer underneath the tree. So if you think about how much nectar is in that flower, it's really the potential for collection is limited by the number of honeybees you have in your hive, right? So You want at this point, when the tulip poplar is blooming, you want your hive to be almost maxed out. You want your hive to be on the verge of thinking about swarming because there's so many bees in it. And you want those bees to be mature worker bees that are capable of foraging, because the nectar is there. It's just a question of getting enough bees up there to collect it. Now, the other thing that sometimes happens, and I think for Walter, this happened last year, is that if we have a big rainstorm in the middle of the flow, it'll just wash all the nectar out of those flowers, because they're basically cups that are at the top of the tree facing up. So the bees are going to, or the nectar can just get poured out of those cups. And then the bees lose that source. So it's variable, and more extreme weather is going to make it more variable than it would normally be. All right, so once we get through the tulip poplar, there's a few other things blooming, but we basically are heading into our summer season. And this is usually the time that we're assessing our hives and collecting honey. And then we're heading into the summer dearth. Now, there are good weeds that come up in the summer. The brassicas still are coming up kind of randomly and blooming. The mullein, everything in that verbascum family. And we mostly know the kind of the upright mullein, but there's a great like moth mullein and a bog mullein. Excellent plants. Everything in the helianthus family, all those little daisies and fleabanes and things like that. All of those are great. Sneezeweed, which obviously you don't want in your like in your fields with your cows. That's a great summer weed for honeybees. Milk thistle and just the whole thistle family is good. So the first of kind of the late spring, early summer trees is locust. Locust trees are beautiful. They used to be a tree we cultivated a lot because it's a very hard wood. So it's a really good wood for fence posts. It's a great tree, and it's kind of fallen out of favor. And around here in the country, you can still see little patches of locust, but it's not as common as it was. And locust is one of those plants that every 3 years, you're going to get a heavier nectar flow, kind of runs cyclically, just in a similar way that we have with acorns tend to run in a 3-year cycle, that one will get a bigger mast from oak trees in the 3rd year. So when you do have locust, if you have a number of them, you can actually create a varietal honey with locust. And it's a very buttery honey. It's got a wonderful flavor. So it's an excellent tree. I'd like to see it in cultivation more, but if you start looking around for it, you'll see some here and there. All right, crepe myrtles. Crepe myrtles are just everywhere, right? We have them all over campus. We have them all over our state, and they're an exotic. The older varieties in particular can be a little invasive. If you go to an old farm site, you might see like a whole field full of crepe myrtles that have seeded themselves in. But in general, they're not super troublesome. And they're a fair nectar and pollen plant. They're not amazing, but bees will work them. You'll see a lot more butterflies and bumblebees on them than you'll see honeybees. But honeybees, if they have no other better source, will go to crepe myrtles. So the Vitex, or the chase tree, is another summer bloomer. This is a beautiful tree. It's got a palmate divided leaf and has this beautiful blue flower, blue purple flower. If you cut them back after the first bloom, you can usually get 2 or 3 more blooms out of them. And honeybees love them. It is an exotic, and it is slightly invasive. I have one in my lawn. And if it drops any seeds, I haven't seen any babies. I tend to mow it, so it's not a problem. If you have it in a formal bed, you may have to pull some babies out of it. It's one of those plants that I think should be used with caution. But it's excellent because it'll bloom in the middle of summer when not many other things will bloom. So in terms of honeybees, it's a very good small tree. There's a really beautiful one. If you want to see an example of a mature one, if you go to the Duke Gardens, the main entrance, just to the left of the gate, there's one that's about at least 20 feet tall and probably 25 feet across. And it's a beautiful, beautiful tree. All right, so mimosas are extremely invasive. We don't plant them anymore, but they are a great honeybee plants. So if you come across a patch of them that's been left somewhere, your bees will really enjoy them. Definitely not something you want to plant. There are new sterile cultivations of mimosa, and I would say that probably in breeding them to be sterile, they may have lost some of their nectar potential. So I'd be curious to see a study of that, but I don't think anybody has done that. All right, privet, one of my least favorite plants. Almost everything in the ligustrum family is very, very spready. It does have berries, which the birds love, but it also tends to spread like a nightmare. So this is a privet up in Roxborough. I've never seen one this big or this full of bloom. Obviously, it's an amazing plant for honeybees. If you had a hive near this bush, it would do very well on this. Makes a terrible tasting honey. It's like overly sweet. I don't recommend planting privet, but it's very hard to get away from. People have it all over the place. People continue to put it in their yards, despite how invasive it is. So while I remove it from any property that I'm associated with, if it's in a neighbor's yard, it's a great plant. And underneath it, you'll see the sacred bamboo, the nandina, which is also an excellent plant for honeybees, and also a plant that can be a little invasive. All right, abelias. There's lots of abelias being cultivated right now. They're really widely used in the landscape. This is the Little Richard, which is kind of the old standard. It blooms all summer long. So it's a great plant in terms of the length of bloom time. Really allows the bees to have something to work throughout the summer. And you'll notice on the lower left hand, is that right? No, the lower right hand flower towards the bottom, you can see where a bumblebee has eaten a little back door into that flower. Even though it was a bumblebee, wouldn't have any problem with the opening at all. Hydrangeas are great. If you have a deer-proof garden. Honeybees love them. They're beautiful. One of my favorite plants, but decimated by deer. And elderberries. So sometimes I think instead of organizing this talk around time period, I should organize it around the functionality of the plants. So an elderberry is a great plant. It's a native. It produces wonderful fruit. It's a great plant for pollinators, especially honeybees. It's a beautiful plant structurally, so it's a nice addition visually to a landscape. If it's in a damp place, they're going to do very, very well. So if you're looking to add plants that you're going to be able to harvest food from your garden, Sambucus is the way to go. All right, kudzu, obviously invasive, obviously exotic. In the Orient, kudzu is an amazing crop plant. They take the roots from it and they make basically a flower substance. And the roots under the ground are just huge. So it's one of those plants. Here, it's invasive and problematic, and there, it's very useful. So I have a whole book that's just about the uses of kudzu, but I would never plant kudzu, but I do take advantage of where it is growing. Honeybees will utilize it. There's some discussion that the famous Carolina blue honey, which is a very rare honey that beekeepers occasionally find in their hives and goes for a very high price if you find it, is from the kudzu. It's supposed to, I've never had it, it's supposed to taste like grape jelly. And if you smell a kudzu flower, that's how they smell. They don't smell like grapes, they smell like grape jelly, which is an odd thing. So, butterfly bushes, fairly invasive. The older ones especially were very spready. The new cultivars are much less so. Beautiful plants, lovely in the landscape. Butterflies obviously love them. Honeybees will work them. Not a great plant, but a good plant. Caryopteris, this is a nice little smaller shrub that's full of tiny purple flowers. Honeybees love this. Nice addition to your garden if you're planting for bees. So the whole Rus family, the whole sumac family is great for honeybees. So around here we have like staghorn sumac, we have smooth sumac. It's usually growing on the edge of the woods, has a very long bloom period. Then it has great berries that are really high in vitamin C. A lot of people use it as a survival drink if you're out in the wilderness and you have very little food source, you can find sumac berries. So also in the sumac family though is poison ivy, which is a climbing form. So this is a upright form, small, it's like a small tree to a large bush, upright, but poison ivy is a vine. So when poison ivy grows up into a tree, it'll produce flowers, which honeybees will work, and then it produces little tiny white berries. The honey from poison ivy is not poisonous, and the bees love it, and the birds love the berries, which is how we get more poison ivy. So while I spend a lot of time weeding poison ivy, I think it definitely has a place in the landscape. It's one of those plants that tends to come in and disturb soil. It tends to like try to stabilize the soil situation and then dies back when other plants come up around it and the situation becomes better for the soil. So sumac family, great for bees. In Europe, you can go and you can see basically cultivated forms of our wild sumac in landscape. And only now in the United States are we beginning to use this plant as a landscape plant, even though it's spectacular. All right, so I included saw palmettos because towards the coast and then in South Carolina, palmettos are the main honey crop for people in those areas, especially in South Carolina. That's like, you go into South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida has a huge selection of honey plants, but those areas, that's going to be your main honey crop. And it's a pretty good honey. I've had palmetto honey before and it's good. And this is just a little tiny saw palmetto in a formal garden that I was working in and got to see bees working. All right, plethora or summer sweet is a plant we're starting to use on campus as a native. It's a little spready. It tends to spread by runners, so it can be a little unruly in a landscape. Towards the coast, this is a wild plant, grows all over the place. Honeybees love it. It's a great summer source for bees. And up towards the mountains, we have Joe Pye weed. This is taken right near my house out in the country, but in the mountains, you find Joe Pye weed everywhere. So eutrochium includes Joe Pye, which is the big plant you see in the mountains. It also includes the little chocolate plant, which you see in cultivation in people's gardens. Along with that, bone set is in the Eutrochium family, which is used for herbal medicine for years. So it's a great family. Honeybees love it. I wouldn't plant the wild Joe Pye in my garden. I might plant a dwarf form of it, but it's a wonderful addition. Obviously, growing along the roadside is a great place for it. And buckwheat. So we talked earlier about cover crops and using crimson clover as a winter cover crop. If you're looking for a summer cover crop for a field where you're not growing grass for a while, or you have a crop that you're going to put in the fall, this is a great summer cover crop. You can plant it on April 15th at the last frost. It'll come up and bloom in 30 days. So what's great about it is you let it come up and bloom, go to seed, you till it under, then you'll have another crop and another crop. You can run this continuously until you hit the fall. And if you're going to leave that field fallow for, say, a year or two before you put crops back into it, then you can follow your buckwheat with the crimson clover. So that means all through the summer, your bees are going to have buckwheat blossoms, and then in the early spring, they're going to have clover. You're also going to be putting nitrogen in the soil, so you're like really improving your soil quality. So this is a nice combination. If you've got a small tractor or a way to till up the soil, you can buy buckwheat seeds and crimson clover seeds at field and garden places, especially out towards the country where they sell seeds in bulk. This is about a half an acre that we planted by my house, and the bees loved it. It only produces nectar in the morning. As it gets warmer in the day, the nectar production cuts off. So you go out at 9 or 10, it's full of bees and pollinators. And then you go out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and it's silent. There's just nothing there. And it's very pretty. And people do harvest buckwheat. They make buckwheat pillows and little neck things that you can heat up. So it's a great plant. Obviously, we've used buckwheat. People talk about buckwheat pancakes and buckwheat honey. For people who grew up on buckwheat honey, they're very attached to it. It's definitely, I think I still have some and I'll try to bring it in. It's an acquired taste. It's almost like molasses. It's very dark, very heavy, strong honey. But if you can make buckwheat honey, you will find an audience of people who want to buy it. Verbena, this is just there's a lot of different verbenas. This is just a nice plant that grows in your formal gardens that the bees will use. Echinacea, all the echinaceas are great for honeybees and also butterflies. Salvias, there are a million kinds of salvias. This is the Mexican salvia, very beautiful, very fuzzy flowers, but there are tons of salvias. And if you have a sunny spot and you have a deer problem, salvia is your plant to go to. And there's a nursery just south of here in Sanford that I utilize a lot called Big Bloomers. They have tons of variety of salvia. Milkweed, obviously we want to plant milkweed because we love monarch butterflies. So, but the milkweed family is really broad. This is a bog milkweed. This was blooming on July 4th. And you can see the amount of bees that are covering this one flower. So I've had trouble with different kinds of milkweed, getting it to do well in the landscape. And I still haven't really figured out what it needs to be super happy. But I definitely think planting more milkweed is it's a great plan. All right, we're going to talk briefly about herbs. Most of the herbs we have in our gardens came from Europe, a lot of them from Italy. Obviously, our bees at this point are mostly Italian bees that grew up with these herbs. So they're all they're really related to each other. So I'm just going to run through them really quickly. Rosemary, chives. So anything in the allium family, whether you're talking about like the wild garlic or ramps up in the mountains, or you're talking about the really fancy allium that's cultivated for gardens, all great for bees. Comfrey, this is a great plant. People use it as a green cover plant. It does tend to spread if you disrupt the roots of it. So if you're digging around it, you'll go from having one plant to having 30 plants. But this is a great plant to underplant in areas. Like say you have fruit trees and you want to put like kind of a green cover crop around your fruit trees. Comfrey is a plant that that's utilized often for that. And one that I'm going to try to utilize more in my personal landscape. Anisaep, this was the pollinator plant of the year, maybe 5 years ago. Beautiful plant, lots of new cultivars. This one's kind of just a standard, but the new ones come in lots of really beautiful colors. Honeybees love this plant. Oregano, great plant for honeybees. Really beautiful flowers. Usually we don't let our oregano go to flower, but if you do, beautiful. Anything in the mint family, and so any of the standard mints, obviously you want to control them, plant them in a place where they have no competition because they're going to outcompete whatever they're near. Heal-all, this is a very old medicinal plant, obviously by the name, but what you're looking at is a cultivated form of it. When you see it growing wild, it's pretty tiny and innocuous. Still really beautiful plant, but this is a cultivated form from a nursery. Lavender, and if anyone wants to grow lavender, just get in touch with me. There's a lot of good resources. Lavender obviously is a great plant for honeybees, great herb to utilize, but difficult to grow in our heavy clay soils. And mountain mint was the pollinator plant of the year, I think 2 years ago. Doesn't have a great smell. It's like a little strong, but spreads really rapidly. It's great. It's a native and it's an excellent plant. All right, so we're back to these seasonal needs. We talked about really needing good forage early in the spring to get the bees jumping. We also need good forage at the late summer, early fall. And that's because the bees that are living right then, when we're kind of coming out of the dirt, those bees are raising the next generation of bees. And that next generation of bees are the ones that are going to overwinter. And that's the critical time for bees, because normally a bee lives 6 to 8 weeks. But the bees that overwinter are going to live through the whole winter until the next generation. So they're not doing a lot of foraging, so they're not like wearing out their wings, but they are keeping the hive warm and taking care of the queen. And so those bees have to be super healthy. So late summer, there's a moment in our year, right? So we're in August and it's super hot. Often it's dry and we're heading into September. And right there, there's this moment where everything shifts and things really start blooming. And if we get enough rain and just a little break from the heat, we'll have a great fall crop. But at that moment, before that happens, depending on how long the summer pushes with the heat and the dryness, that's when a colony can starve to death. So that's a time to be in your hives every 2 weeks. Even if all you're doing is lifting the hive, and we talked about that right in an earlier class, you take the back of your hive and you lift it up. If it comes off the ground, you do not have enough stores in that hive and you need to be putting sugar water on it and feeding those bees. In the field day, did you guys look at different ways of feeding bees? Okay. Excellent. the top feeders that you guys have, that's what I use at home. And it's really nice because you can fill them up without disturbing the bees. So you can just add a little sugar water to them. You can check on how much there is in them. So it's a really rapid, easy way to keep them fed. But that's that moment, late summer, early fall, mid-August. And that's a critical time in lots of ways for the bees. And the bees are not going to be as friendly then. Like in the springtime, when the honey flows on, you can wear your tank top and your shorts and you can go in the hive and barely smoke the bees. And they're going to be so friendly and so happy to see you. And in late summer, when it's hot and dry and they're hungry, they're going to be grouchy and they're not going to want to see you and they're not really going to want you to visit them. So that moment in time is critical, especially being aware of what's going on weather-wise and what's going on bloom-wise. So then we head into fall and we hope we get a really good fall. And most years we do, because most of the fall plants are used to dry conditions. Like they've grown up over the summer and then the temperature shifts just a little bit and they start blooming. So I'm going to talk about basically all these plants in more detail, but our fall weeds are also really our fall plants. So the whole aster family, which is immense, and there's weedy asters that grow on the edges of the woods. There's asters really that bloom in the springtime that are gorgeous. And then there are like climbing asters and fragrant asters. There's just a range of asters available. So any setting you can find a good aster for. And this is one of the key plants that helps your bees over winter. And you can see the beautiful pollen pack on the back of this honeybee. Goldenrod is your other standard. Obviously, goldenrod grows in ditches and on the sides of the roads, but there are lots of new cultivations of goldenrod. There's a new one called Fireworks that's a very pale yellow, really beautiful plant. So if you have ditches or fields, you can just let the goldenrod do its thing. If you have a formal garden, it's a nice addition to your garden. The tickseed Biden's family really varies. These are the more ornamental flowers. This is up near Roxborough. It's a whole field. And it has some sunflowers in it, but 90% of what it has are just Biden's. So obviously there's a beautiful monarch in love with that flower, but also the honeybees will totally work those flowers. And then sunflowers, honeybees will work. They prefer the perennial sunflowers, these giant annual sunflowers that we grow that are really impressive tend to have less nectar and less pollen on them. They've been kind of over cultivated, so they're not always the best. So I was I think I was at CCC and we were checking out their hives on their campus, and they had like 6 hives set up, and then they had this field of sunflowers, and I walked around this field of sunflowers, and there are bees everywhere, honeybees everywhere. And the only bee that I saw on the sunflower was this one bumblebee. But the native sunflowers, the bog sunflowers, the swamp sunflowers, all of those honeybees will completely work, and as well as lots of native pollinators. All right, so my main bottom line, and this gets me in trouble with other landscapers all the time, is learning to love your weeds. Weeds are going to be one of the best friends to your honeybees. So changing your attitude about weeds where you can, and I'm not saying stop weeding at all. I'm just saying adjust your attitude to what's beautiful. So a dandelion is a perfect example. We're taught by grass seed companies and chemical companies that the dandelions are the bane of our lawns and that we should not allow dandelions to come up in our lawns. But why in the world would you not want this lovely little yellow flower coming up in your lawn? It's beautiful. If you mow it, it's just going to bloom closer to the ground. Has a incredibly deep taproot. It's pulling up nutrients from the subsoil into your soil. So it's actually improving the soil that your grass is living in. So it's making your grass healthier. You can make wine out of it. You can eat the leaves in early spring. It's a great all-around plant, and honeybees love it. So if we shift our aesthetic just slightly and we say our yards should not look like golf courses, and we shift our idea of beauty from this monoculture where all you have are evergreen bushes that are shaped into little meatballs and perfectly green lawns that are mowed to the exact same height every week, we can have a really beautiful yard that is also really healthy. So this is just a map kind of showing you where some of the different plants we talked about were. I didn't talk about basswood very much. That's a great honey plant that grows up in the mountains. I didn't talk about tupelo gums, but gum trees are a great tree for honeybees and produce a lot of the nectar and honey surplus down by the coast. We obviously are in the Piedmont. And here's a little picture of different kinds of honey and different forms of honey. So I'm hoping next class, Walter's going to bring us some of his creamed honey to try. And I'm going to bring some different varietal honeys. And here's a list of some of the common varietal honeys. Now, a lot of times around here, you'll see people say they have a spring honey. That's not technically a varietal honey because it's not from one crop, but it is an early honey that's made mostly with early blooming fruit trees, mainly probably the Prunus family. And it's just got a slight fruity taste. Blueberry we talked about, it's a great honey, very distinctive. Clover is the most common. Tulip poplar, that's our main honey crop here. Up in the mountains, there's sourwood honey, which is very, very pale and has a really distinctive kind of high note to it. People talk about wildflower honey, and usually that's like a later season honey. And it's often a darker honey. And you can call anything wildflower honey. You can say early spring honey, but if you're going to say you have blueberry or sourwood, you need to make sure that 51% of the nectar source is from a single plant or a single variety of plant. So when we say sourwood honey, 51% of the nectar that's brought in came from sourwood trees. And the way they test for that is they look at the honey and they look for pollen samples in the honey. And legally, you are supposed to, there's a big problem up in the mountains of people saying, oh, I've got sourwood honey, but it's not actually sourwood honey. So what we really like as small beekeepers is to make sure that we're presenting the public and educating the public on the value of varietal honeys. So if you're just selling tulip poplar honey, you would have kind of a set honey price for that. But if you were selling a varietal honey, you would ask for more money because that's harder to get and takes more work. And then buckwheat we talked about before, and hopefully I'll bring in some buckwheat for us to taste. This is just showing you if you're harvesting honey, the upper frame in the picture is tulip poplar. The bottom frame is blueberry. So see the difference in color? And when you're harvesting honey, this is what you want your frames to look at. Like, see how the honey is drawn all the way out? The frame is completely full. Those are beautiful frames that's really what our goal is as beekeepers. If we're looking to get honey, we're looking to get frames filled out, drawn out like that, and full of honey. And this is just a little note that's really important to me. Most of our honey plant books are from the 1920s. I ordered a used copy of American Honey Plants online. And when I got it, these really thin pieces of paper fell out of it. And this note fell out, which is a note that someone took. And it says May 23rd, 1926, American Honey Plants. And then they write Mountain Plateau region, alfalfa, Maine, sweet clover after, wild buckwheat, rabbit brush in the fall, and it's a desert plant. And I won't read the rest of it, but what they're doing, here's a beekeeper in 1926 who's researching what forage is available in a specific area for their honeybees. And that's exactly what we're doing. And if you went back to Egypt, there would be Egyptian beekeepers who were doing precisely the same thing. They're learning about plants that their bees are utilizing because we have this relationship. The bee has a relationship between the plants, and we have a relationship with the plants and with the bees. And it's this amazing connection that the bees push us to be better caretakers of the earth, right? Because they're providing us with the sweetness of honey, and we're providing them with extra forage because we're helping take care of these plants that are important to them. So it's this amazing relationship. And if you think about how humans have evolved alongside honeybees and carried honeybees. Think about people coming to the Americas, and in the 1600s, they put their bees in wooden boxes and carried them across the ocean. Can you imagine? Like, you think about putting, a beehive in the back seat of your car with, 3 pounds of bees in it. But say you're taking a big hive of honeybees and you're putting it on a rolling ship and you're carrying it across the ocean with you to take to the new world because you need honeybees that much. So that relationship between us and plants and bees, that's an amazing thing. And so for me, as a landscaper and also a beekeeper, this is like the point, the midpoint that to me is super powerful. So I love honeybees and I love learning about them, but learning about plants and honeybees is obviously my deepest passion. And finding this letter was just amazing for me. So thanks everybody. We're gonna take questions, but probably not for long because I think we've run way over. So maybe we won't take questions now. Maybe we'll try to take questions about this next class. Because I'm out of town. The next class should be here. Thursday, the early April. Is that right? Or late March? The 31st. All right. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for coming out.